Welcome to a Tech Moment on Cannabis Tech. I'm your host, KRISTINA ETTER. In this podcast, we take just a few minutes to talk about some of the exciting science and technology that is kind of shaping and impacting the cannabis and hemp industries. And one of the things that we don't talk about a whole lot is in terms of marketing for cannabis, whether it's on social media or just content marketing in general. Google algorithms and social media companies literally wreak havoc on the cannabis industry, hemp businesses, and marketing teams have this constant struggle and walk this fine line between compliance and reaching their target audience. Many times companies find out once they get published that much of what they need to say to their consumers can actually land them in hot water. My guest today is well-versed in all things when it comes to marketing in a highly regulated industry. Before transitioning to the cannabis industry, Courtney Wu worked in the highly regulated industry of professional gambling, leading the pro and celebrity marketing department with PokerStars. Today, as the founder and CEO of AMNESIA, an influencer marketing platform for the cannabis industry, she is taking strides to helping companies stay compliant and make it easier for cannabis and hemp industry businesses to market their products. Welcome to the show, Courtney.
Hi, KRISTINA. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate you guys spending the time with me today.
Oh, we love it. But before we dive into the actual topic of the hour, the first thing that I love to do on these podcasts is give you an opportunity to talk about yourself a little bit. So you have an extraordinary history in marketing, and I would love for you to talk to our audience a little bit about that history and what has actually brought you into cannabis and founding AMNESIA.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting and circuitous route. I think a lot of folks kind of are curious about what would actually create someone who really loves compliance and regulated industries and education and all the things that kind of are associated with that. But where my career really started was I was your prototypical Asian American kid where I was pre-med. It was something that I was very interested in doing and being in clinical settings. But on my pathway to that, I actually got involved in public health and actually found my love there. And, public health really includes looking at things like, various facets that impact access to healthcare, whether that's education and helping young folks actually find out how they can access healthcare. And so with that, my focus was actually working at Planned Parenthood and helping youth access and and bring up civic engagement rights for young people in terms of how to access healthcare services that were associated with their reproductive healthcare. So kind of sticking along the lines of those taboo subjects. And eventually I decided I wanted to really focus on policy development, and that brought me over to the UK to pursue my postgraduate degree in the UK looking at health policy specifically. And I graduated at the peak of the recession. Most folks are not going to be spending on preventative health care during that time. And so I ended up actually being recruited by the PokerStars team into the pro and celebrity marketing department, thinking that I was going to figure out a way to get back into public health and saying that, this isn't for me. But I actually found another passion at PokerStars was really looking at how we built the brand in regulated spaces. And that was something that, what you do in Argentina, what you do in Singapore, what you do in the Netherlands is completely different from one another because it's highly regulated and fragmented. And so pretty much after that, I took a bit of a sabbatical for a couple of years to kind of figure out what my next moves were. And I was recruited into the cannabis industry by some of my former colleagues in the gambling space and was brought in as the CMO of an agency that was working with a lot of brands that were transitioning from the medical space to the adult use market in Nevada at that time, and really ran into a huge issue, which is we were, developing go-to-market strategies for these brands. But we saw that, no matter how great the brand was, we were actually having to fly influencers into Nevada to be able to actually represent these brands because of the fragmentation of the industry, because of the compliance issues around that. And so from there, I actually founded AMNESIA. We initially started with an influencer marketing platform that had compliance layers built into it. But what we've launched today most recently is actually an AI platform that doesn't look at content only from influencers, but content from any sort of content creator, whether that is some content that's developed in-house, whether that's content that is developed by an influencer as well. And our core is really looking at that content to making sure that it's going to be compliant with various regulations and actually help brands get that content in front of the right folks to engage with it.
I love that. And I think anybody that has been in the cannabis industry or cannabis space for any amount of time now understands that there's just some things that are going to gain more attention when you're doing content marketing. There's certain words, there's certain things that are always going to kind of put those companies at risk. And one of the things that I want to talk about before we actually dive into your solution is just acknowledging the fact that even with cannabis being legal nationwide, there's always going to be a need for compliance. I mean, there's never going to be a time where just anything goes in cannabis. I mean, television ads for cigarettes were banned 50 years ago. There's, restrictions on where gambling can be advertised or where alcohol can be advertised. There's rules in place, and it's not just the cannabis industry. So I would love to hear your perspective on that and just kind of, reinforce the idea that compliance isn't ever going to go away.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the great hopes of our industry, and it's something that we hear quite a bit. So, in our time, and actually as we were developing the platform, we actually worked as an agency with some of the biggest brands in the space, and really helping them develop a lot of that content. And, what we do hear from a lot of our clients, and again, a lot of folks as a whole in the industry, is this hope that once federal regulations come, that essentially marketing is going to get that much easier. And the reality is compliance is never going to go away. As you mentioned, we can see this especially even with my experience in the gambling industry, right? The online gambling space, even as it was regulated, in fact, the regulators had more teeth to go after people when it came to marketing infractions, and had more resources available to actually do that. We're an agency that really serviced some of the largest brands in the industry to develop content for them. And the hope, of course, was that the content, while 100% compliant, could be used across the board and very easily used for paid advertising. And I think what we do understand now is that, especially with social media platforms, they don't engage in paid advertising because of federal regulations. But even as federal regulations do come in the future, what we know from the gambling industry is that it's still going to have an impact. Compliance is still going to be there. In fact, what ends up happening is that the regulators, so again, my time in the gambling space, we saw gray markets transition into being regulated markets, and how a lot of marketing laws and what have you and regulations changed over that period of time. And what really happened as a large trend across multiple jurisdictions was essentially the regulators get more teeth. They have more abilities to actually start pursuing marketing infractions when it comes to compliance. And one of the other key things when it comes to the social media platforms, where they may be more readily and open to taking money from that specific industry with changes in regulations, there's still huge compliance considerations to be made. So when it came to the gambling space, you had to submit your advertisements for compliance checks from the platforms. There were special publisher designations, all sorts that comes to compliance when it comes to marketing in any sort of highly regulated and age-restricted product that's fragmented.
Absolutely. So let's dive into the problem in general in cannabis marketing. Now, it seems like to me, cannabis is especially scrutinized. I know that there's certain keywords, there's certain things that automatically kind of flag these companies. Like you mentioned, social media a lot of times will shut down people's accounts, things like that. And based on this most recent press release that you shared, this is becoming kind of an increasing issue. It's not really decreasing. So do you want to talk about some of those problems that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think one of the issues around compliance in our space is not only, and especially in this modern world, is it's not just about compliance from regulators, but it's also about compliance from the publishing platforms such as Instagram, right? And so when Instagram is such an important component for cannabis marketing, really one of the only ways in which people or brands can have direct access to their consumers and their community, and actually educate their community on how, best cannabis consumption practices really should look like, especially for themselves and making those active decisions, it's really difficult for these cannabis brands to market, because it's, again, not just the regulators that are looking at compliance, but it's also social media platforms that are not actually entirely clear about what that actually has to look like within their platform. And it's a private company, right? Ultimately, it can decide what is allowed and what isn't. What we've seen essentially in a partnership that we've been talking through with Pioneer Intelligence is that even from the last year, from 2020 to 2021, we've already seen seen an 8 to 17%, so more than 100% increase in Instagram shutdowns and shadow bans accounts of cannabis brands specifically. So these are cannabis brands that are, again, reputable. They are licensed brands, and they're also being shut down by these social media platforms. And it's really difficult for them to navigate this space because these community guidelines from these platforms are not entirely clear about what it means to build a community around cannabis in social media.
Right. Right. And, you mentioned the different platforms. Even on LinkedIn here recently, I've seen some of my colleagues out there publishing that some of their content is being taken down on LinkedIn. And LinkedIn in the past has always been, in my opinion, a little more forgiving of the cannabis industry and allows a little bit more, I think. But you mentioned one term, the shadow banning. I'd love to hear more about that. What exactly is it, and why is it so very important for cannabis marketers to understand what's happening there?
So shadow banning is something that is, really our industry's bane of our existence, if you will. It's, essentially what happens in that case is an Instagram account is actually allowed to still publish. They still have all access to their account. They're still able to kind of act normally, if you will. But what ends up happening is a lot of their content is no longer served to their community anymore. So that means that content is not showing up in the feed. That's not showing up for their community. And this really, again, has a huge impact for cannabis brands specifically because we all know that in direct-to-consumer marketing or in marketing nowadays as a whole, content marketing and influencer marketing is really key to actually reaching and acquiring customers at scale. It's really key for building relationships with your community and your brand, getting feedback about your products, but also, again, building that relationship with your consumer. And ultimately, if a shadow ban takes place for a cannabis brand, that could mean a loss in revenue. That could mean a loss in essentially their ability to connect with their community at scale, right? And so again, shadow ban means that, they can create all the content they want, but essentially at the end of the day, that published content's not actually reaching their community anymore.
Yeah, and it's so frustrating, especially at least from my perspective, being a writer, being a content creator. It's frustrating when those kinds of things happen because just like other businesses, other companies want to be able to use social media to help reach their audience, engage with their audience. A lot of times it seems like that's becoming increasingly difficult in these traditional platforms that we have. And one of the things that, at least it's frustrating for me, is the fact that you can turn on the television, you can drive down the road, we see billboards everywhere for alcohol, you can walk into any store, there's no regulations, other than you have to be 21 to buy it. And there's not a patient registry for alcohol. So it's fascinating to me to see how these different industries kind of intersect in marketing, even in pharmaceutical companies. It's fascinating to me that in the United States, we're one of 2 countries that actually allow pharmaceutical companies to advertise to the end consumer. And we see what's happened there. There were 93,000 overdose deaths, I think, in 2020. So it's interesting to me to kind of see how this goes. But there's really never going to be a time, at least from your perspective, that cannabis cannabis advertising is going to be really acceptable, really? I mean, do you see it that way? Or do you think there's going to be a lifting of this eventually? I mean, obviously there's still going to be compliance, but do you think it's ever really going to be considered acceptable to see cannabis ads like we do alcohol ads or pharmaceutical ads?
I think it really depends on the jurisdiction. Unfortunately, I've started seeing a pharmaceutical ad exports overseas recently on my trip back from the UK. And so, as you mentioned, New Zealand and the US being the only countries where that's allowed, it is something that is starting to take root. And we are actually getting interest from those sectors about our software as well, because there are compliance standards that also apply to them. So that being said, I think when it comes to cannabis marketing, I think it really will depend on the jurisdiction. I think that we have some hope, especially in places like California, California that have a much more positive and healthy attitude towards cannabis as a whole, that could be the case. As you mentioned, compliance will still always be a factor, whether that's about advertising after a watershed, looking at different audience demographics, or, especially again, what that content actually is. So the content of the content, if you will, is really important there. But I do think we're very far away from that. I think that, it takes, and one of the key things and one of the key reasons I got into this space is actually respecting folks like yourself, content creators, who are really trying to actually change perceptions around cannabis and create a healthier attitude towards cannabis, one that is positive but also well informed. And I think, the more folks that we have building content around that on social media platforms, that's going to help change the landscape for maybe some of the more institutional media outlets like television, like those kind of, again, more traditional media outlets that, really treat publication in a one-way direction. And I think that's also the huge change that we're seeing, right? So, as much as we may not see as much TV advertisements around cannabis, I think what we really have to recognize is that marketing today really looks at publication in a very different way. Before you have a publisher, you have the content creator, which is usually a production studio, and you have the publisher, and that's, these very entrenched forces. But now with the advent of social media, everyone is a content creator, everyone is a publisher. And that really changes the landscape of advertising as a whole. And so again, when we see things like, social media influences 71% of sales, that is really kind of where I see marketing going to in the future. It's not to say that there's not a special place for, again, TV marketing or media, but again, that kind of advertising is already taking place in social media platforms. And to ignore that is to ignore what, again, the future holds for marketing as a whole.
Right. And one of the things I just want to touch on there, just because you bring up influencer marketing and things like that, it seems, a lot of times you hear the word influencer and it seems like there's a little bit of a negative connotation there when you see it out in the public. But the one thing that I want to point out is that with social media, with these platforms, we're all influencers in a way. If we weren't attempting to influence somebody, we wouldn't publish things on social media in the first place. So I think that although the term influencer, some people frown on that right now, we really have to embrace the fact that the world has become a much smaller place, and we all have a little bit of influence in our circles, regardless of whether or not we're really trying to promote a product or change somebody's mind, or maybe it's in politics or whatever it is that we post about on social media. We all kind of have a little bit of that influencer, and I love the fact that you point that out. We've all become publishers. Anybody that has these accounts is publishing their thoughts and publishing their ideas, and that's going to influence other people. So I think it's great that you brought it up from that perspective.
Thanks. And I appreciate that. I do think the term influencer is much maligned. I think that, again, folks kind of look at it and they see these very negative aspects of influencers. But the reality is, whether we call them content creators or influencers, and there is a distinction even within that scope. But the reality is ultimately, it's like most technology, right? I mean, it can be used for good or bad. And it's really about the people who are behind the technology who choose to use it, right? And, this is one of the core reasons we do what we do when we think about content, because content can be weaponized, as we've seen. And it is important to really understand who's responsible for publishing. And again, what kind of content are they publishing? Is that healthy for communities? And so, again, you could have influencers. Influencers were huge when it came to public health messaging in the recent COVID crisis, right? That was a big thing in terms of recruiting influencers, whether that was, having influencers who reflect certain communities and are the voices of their communities, but also the voices of the medical community. That can be considered an influencer. Additionally, you still have influencers who just shoot things like nud porn, right? And so it really can run the gamut. And it's really important to recognize that content creators are not all created equal. They're not monoliths. Ultimately, at the end of the day, they all have different things to say, and they all have very different communities that they create. And so again, when it comes to marketing, it's truly trying to understand that and really understand the journey of that content, and how that content really makes people feel, how it really helps people engage with a certain community, or even see themselves in a community that they never once aligned themselves with. And so content is really key to that. And again, we take very seriously the health of society through content.
What a wonderful segue into the next group of questions that I have, because I want to talk about the AMNESIA solution. The press release that recently came out talks about Highlyte, and this is an AI-based technology that is that's aimed at helping marketers kind of keep those public statements in compliance and help them avoid some of these negative actions that we see. Obviously, everybody's seen, the stories about the FDA sending out letters, or the FTC, kind of calling out some of these CBD companies. So tell me a little bit about your solution, Highlyte, and what kind of tech that it uses to help marketers stay in compliance with their advertising.
Thank you so much for highlighting Highlyte. And so, with Highlyte, what we have built is essentially an artificial intelligence platform that scans any sort of content, whether that's image content, video content, or copy content, for, again, captions or writing blogs and that sort of thing, for compliance with various state regulations when it comes to cannabis advertising. In addition to that, one of the core features, and kind of built from our experience as an agency, is actually also our Instagram health check feature. And what that does is look at content that's already been published on Instagram to see if it's at risk or low risk, not only with state regulations and compliance, but also looking at social media community guidelines and best practices. Those best practices are proprietary to us, and it's something that we built. We are very proud of our 100% compliance with zero shadow bans and loss of accounts. And so zero account shutdowns across the board from Instagram, which is really unheard of in our space. And it's really key. And again, our solution is designed to help any sort of content creator, whether that content is being created in-house, whether that content is being created by, a third-party content creator brought in-house to actually publish on behalf of a brand. So whether that's an influencer or even a content creator who's just a photographer, not just, but a wonderful photographer and focusing on creating photography assets. Our software allows for people to check that compliance in real time. So, before committing to a flat lay that the photographer may be setting up and the creative director may be setting up, they can check it for compliance to make sure the content is going to be compliant with, again, social media and state regulations. Because for us, it's really important to recognize that, even content itself is a huge investment, especially for cannabis brands. And, developing content, as a content creator, is not easy. And so it's a huge investment up front. And so we want to make sure we're supporting marketers and content creators all the way from start to finish when it comes to compliance. So whether or not that's checking the content in advance, along that content creation process, or even after publication within Instagram, in case, what was compliant yesterday may not be compliant today with regulation changes.
That's fascinating. And I hadn't even looked at it from that perspective, and we know that regulations, laws, restrictions, all of these things are changing so quickly in the cannabis space that things can change. And a lot of times that what was once compliant may no longer be compliant. And I think it's always good to have technology tools like this that are going to help keep those kinds of things in check. But specifically, can you give me some examples really of what, obviously content marketing, I know that there's keywords, there's things that kind of flag issues, but what kinds of things specifically does Highlyte really look for and help marketers with?
Some of the key things that we look for, again, are those things like, does it appeal to children or minors, right? That's one of the things that we recognize, again, for community considerations as well. We want to make sure that the cannabis industry is acting responsibly and not trying to appeal to minors. In certain states, you also can't co-market alcohol alongside cannabis. And so our AI is looking for things like alcohol within the content, or things that could be perceived as alcohol. Additionally, when it comes to language, as a use case, one of the clients that we work with now, one of their more junior team members and copywriters was able to actually change a lot of their verbiage for copy based on uploading it into our software and seeing that, this could be considered high risk when it comes to copy. So we need to figure out a better way to, kind of market this and talk about this without, for instance, making false health claims. I think that's a big one for us, especially with my background in public health, that we're really concerned about. You kind of mentioned things around, the FDA, cease and desist letters. It's really, again, making sure that any sort of representations around cannabis are going to be accurate with what's actually viable and what's actually available in, scientific newsletters and what's reputable.
Right. And it's interesting too to point out that I'm one of those people. I get it. I believe in the benefits of cannabis. I believe in the benefits of CBD. I believe in all of these things. However, there's a fine line between talking about benefits and making those health claims or making a product come across as snake oil. And that's a lot of marketing these days. I feel like it does come across like that. And I think in the long run, compliance like this is actually helping the consumer as much as anyone, because there are restrictions. There are things that I've seen in the market, that I just look at and I kind of shake my head and I'm thinking, wow, how are they getting by with saying these things? Because, there's a fine line there. And I think people really need to understand that, yes, cannabis and CBD can help a lot of people, but making those claims, you've got to be very, very careful about that.
I actually think that it actually hurts our industry long term to make those claims. And I think, to be really clear, as much as we're super pro compliance, we're also very pro cannabis. And I think, even going back to the inception of our software was to actually help influencers actually create that content to help, and again, be compliant, to help educate their own communities around proactive cannabis consumption choices. And the reality is that, if people are saying things like, to take a really kind of broad health claim that is quite inaccurate, is to say that, cannabis cures cancer. Things like that really actually hurt our industry long term, because when people start to look at the cannabis industry and can point out that, it's not this, balm of Gilead that's just going to solve everyone's problems, that's true. But that doesn't take away from the actual health benefits or the research that should actually take place to support what cannabis truly can do. And I think by saying things like, oh, it cures cancer, or by being, again, maybe not as egregious as that or as far as that, but again, by making inaccurate health statements, what we're doing is eroding trust in consumers and treating consumers without respect, I think. And I think it's about respecting consumers, that they need to trust the industry, because the industry is still fairly new for the average person when it comes to, what that experience is going to be like, whether that's walking into a dispensary, whether that's even proactively making a choice around their cannabis. If people are not responsible, again, about the type of content they're publishing, it could very much impact how that consumer actually engages with the product, right? So whether or not they're taking things that are not appropriate for them, whether or not, they're having this hope that it's going to cure something like cancer, when the reality is, again, it can support aspects of that, but it can't cure it necessarily.
Right. And it's interesting to me as someone that writes, verbiage is obviously very important to me. And I think that using those words appropriately is just, kind of common sense. I understand that people are trying to sell a product, but at the same time, if you put these outlandish claims out there and the product doesn't live up to that, eventually that's going to catch up to you. And I think that's one of the reasons why your software is so very important for cannabis businesses and marketers. Do you want to touch on that just a little bit too, as why this is just so very important for the business as well as it is for the consumer?
I think first and foremost is, as a business, especially in the cannabis industry, with things like without federal regulation, marketing in its own right is so difficult. And so if you're a responsible cannabis brand that's really tried to build your community within a place like Instagram, which is really great, again, for community dialogue. Let's say you build up your followers to like 100,000 followers, and those are all authentic to you. Losing that through deactivation by making, egregious health claims or what have you, losing that overnight is a huge impact to the business in its own right, whether that's about the brand value, whether that's about its ability to actually sell directly to consumers. From a business perspective, it is really important to make sure that you're compliant, because you're already investing so many resources, not only in the content development itself, but engaging in that community, whether that's having a social media hire who is in there talking to your community all the time. We know of brands that actually even use their social media channels as almost one of their first customer service portals as well. And so making sure sure that that's there, and, feeling confident that that's not going to be shut down, that the content itself is not going to be the thing that shuts you down. Another way that it's really important is that a lot of brands, because content is such a heavy investment from a cost perspective, as well as from human, financial, what have you, a resource perspective, a lot of brands are sharing content with each other. And so, there's also another risk there of, like, if you share another brand's content, if they're not necessarily compliant, that can also hurt your brand, right? Ultimately, Instagram's not going to care who actually created that content. What they care about is who published that content. And so it's important for brands to really invest in this process. And the reality is that right now, compliance teams are really focused on things like licensing compliance, operational compliance, financial compliance, these things that are kind of huge behemoths. And unfortunately, marketers are often not supported in the same way when it comes to compliance. But again, have a very visible, just to stay up to date with marketing. They have to publish every single day to stay top of mind with their consumers, to compete with all of the other content that is vying for their consumers' attention. And so with that kind of heavy and intense content cycle, and then the lack of support around compliance from internal compliance teams, it really kind of creates this perfect storm for people to lose their accounts, their investment into Instagram, as well as, put themselves at risk with regulators as well. And so our software really tries to support the marketer, as well as give, room for the compliance team to set what those parameters are, but truly, again, support those marketers with that content development cycle and the heavy requests that come of them to be good at their job and be compelling in marketing.
Completely agree. And as a content creator myself, there's already a ton of tools that I use. When we publish things, we always double check the content for plagiarism, and we check for grammar issues, and we check for all of these different things, and we have tools that help us with that. So Highlyte really is just kind of that other tool in the toolbox, I think, for marketers in this space to be able to do that final checks and balances on the things that they're publishing and make sure that it's all kosher and it's all good, and that it's not going to bring all of this unwanted attention, to their site. And I would assume that you're probably seeing a lot of interest in this. I would assume there's other marketers out there like me that use digital tools like this. So how is it going? I mean, are you seeing quite a bit of engagement?
We are, which we're very fortunate. We're really lucky. We've been building up a strong community around us as well. And we've had the benefit of user testing with some of the top brands, again, in the space to help us understand how to best solve their problems, right? And so it's going super well. Our launch has been beyond what we could expect, especially for an open beta launch. We're talking to some pretty huge folks that are really interested in our software because, again, they really recognize the need. And what's been really wonderful is seeing compliance teams also really start to support our software as well, not just the marketers. That we find that the marketers are really our champions internally because, again, they feel this need so acutely, and again, don't have the resources to support them. And the compliance teams, we're not here to replace them. We're here to support them as well. And seeing them react so positively to our software and saying that, now it makes their jobs easier, it makes them more confident that the marketing team can also be compliant, has been really great for us to hear and see. So I really can't ask for more, and I do want to take this moment to thank the team that we have for helping us build the software and make it what it is today.
So how do our listeners get in touch with you, or maybe do you have a trial for Highlyte? How can they use this and determine whether or not it's going to be a good fit for their program?
Yeah, we do actually have a freemium model. So anyone here that's in the cannabis space or even not can actually sign up for our free Instagram health check. And so what that enables you to do is to link your Instagram account really quickly and easily and see whether or not, what type of risk that you have through a report, looking at various trends in risk, but also looking at actual content itself and deep diving on that content to see what's putting you at risk and why. And so I welcome anybody to actually sign up for that. They can do that at AMNESIAmedia.io. Everything's spelled correctly. So AMNESIAmedia.io again. You can also find us on Instagram at AMNESIAmedia, and feel free to DM us. We're more than happy to have conversations with folks and chat with people about all things content and compliance.
Fantastic, Courtney. You know, I think this is one of the most important conversations in cannabis right now, simply because, like you said, businesses are really trying to get that foothold. They're trying to get their name out there. They're trying to hit their target audience. But at the same time, there's just so many challenges, and there's so many things that are, you know, kind of impeding that progress. And tools like this are just, I think, essential in our industry to help people make sure that they're staying compliant and doing things right and doing the best for their company, and not doing things to, you know, essentially shoot themselves in the foot just by using a few wrong words or maybe a wrong image or things like that. So it's definitely a useful tool, and we can't wait to kind of see how things go at AMNESIA with this platform, and hopefully there's some businesses out there that are looking at this thinking, oh, that is exactly what we need. But it's been a joy, Courtney, and I love having you here on the show, and I'm hoping that maybe we can, you know, make this a regular thing and bring you back occasionally to talk about all of these nuances and changes and things that are happening in cannabis marketing.
Thank you so much again, Kristina, for having me and sharing with your community about Highlyte as well. And so hopefully, and again, welcome anyone who has questions around content and compliance to always reach out to us and have that conversation. More than happy to join you again as well. And so thank you so much for having me here today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your time today, Courtney.